Station 51, engine 27, engine 32, truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Steve Wolf. Welcome back to The Fire Break, right here on the Team Wildfire Network. That's what I'm going to call it now. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technology for suppressing big fires. Check us out on the web, teamwildfire.com. I have got with me today one of the great influences on the future reduction of wildfire, he hopes, and I hope so too. This is Patrick Wright, and he's the director of the Governor's Wildfire and Resilience Task Force. That is a big title, Patrick.
Sure. Well, it's a big title because we have a big job. The governor and the director of the Forest Service several years ago gave us a charge to treat 1 million acres annually. And so to try to do that collectively is a big challenge.
Okay. And so that is a lot of land. And at what point does that stop? I mean, up to 10, up to 40 million? How long do they want to?
Well, there's roughly 30 million acres that need treatment. There's a lot to do. And so, and of course, it never ends because once you finish the first cycle of what we call initial treatments, you've got to go in at least every 10 to 15 years to do what we call maintenance treatments. So it's a never-ending process for the task force to align federal, state, local, private, tribal interests to try to get that work done on a much bigger scale than we've ever had to in the past.
I see. So if you got math was never my strong suit, but I'm going to try this. If you're trying to treat 30 million acres and you have to get to them every 10 years, you need to work your capacity up to 3 million acres a year. Is that right?
Well, some of our estimates are closer to everywhere from 1 million, which is our target, up to about 2 million. Regardless, so it's a big job. It varies by location. One thing your listeners should know, Southern California, Northern California, very different. Northern California is like much of the forested West, where because of a century of fire suppression, we have overgrown forest. And when you combine that with the impacts of climate change, we need to do a lot more thinning, a lot more prescribed fire to thin the forest. In Southern California, it's a different situation. In Southern California, there's actually too much fire as opposed to there being not enough fire. And so there, it's to try to deal with these Santa Ana winds that come up every fall and really try to reduce ignitions along highways, along utility lines. So we've got Northern California, Southern California with two very different strategies to try to reduce the impacts of these megafires.
Very, very interesting. Of your 1 million acre goal, how did you do this year?
Well, that's a good question. We track acres two different ways. One way we track it is what we call activity acres, which is how much work did you get done? And this last year, we actually got done about 1 million acres. The caveat, though, is often you have to treat the same acre 2 or 3 times. So you might go in if a forest is particularly dense and you thin it and then you do a prescribed fire. So we count both of those because you need the funding and the resources to do that, to keep track of that. But for the public really cares about how many acres, footprint acres have been treated, not how many treatments took place on that acre. So we do both. So the bigger number is about 1 million last year. The smaller number is about 750,000.
Okay. So that 1 million acres could be like 300,000 actual acres that got treated 3 times.
But the target, the 1 million acre target, is treatment acres. So what we're saying is we're roughly at 750. We hope to scale up to 1 million.
That's great.
To scale up to 1 million, that really means about 1.5 million or so of different treatments because, maybe half the acreage gets treated twice.
Okay. How many acres are in the state?
100 million total, exactly. 100 million of land, about 30 million is forested. And virtually all of those need, treatments every, as I said, every 10 to 15 years or so.
So is the strategy to work from the WUI out?
Generally, there's actually a big debate over that. We're actually having a big task force meeting. We're bringing in the top scientists in the West and asking them questions about, should we focus primarily in the WUI or the general forest? Should we start getting into more sensitive areas rather than going where we've been traditionally going? Clearly the answer is some of both. The priority, of course, is doing treatments around communities. But you can't neglect the general forest either, given the range and extent of fires. So we try to do as much of both as we possibly can.
And you can't really swing back the other way to no treatment in the forested areas because now that it's continuous canopy,
That's right.
the forest can't regulate its fires the way it could before intervention. Is that right?
That's true, although I think where we're beginning to focus is rely more on prescribed fire, intentionally set fires in the general forest, focus more on mechanical treatments in the WUI. Because in the WUI, your focus is protecting communities, whereas in the general forest, we care just as much about biodiversity, water quality, carbon storage. Prescribed fire, much cheaper and much broader set of benefits. So I think you're going to see over time us ramping up prescribed fire in the general forest and ramping up mechanical treatments where you bring equipment in to do fuel reduction projects surrounding communities.
I see. Okay. So two different strategies for two different areas. Right. How did you develop the strategies that you're working with now?
Well, so I started the job about 4 years ago. And like a lot of areas throughout the West, all the agencies and work across the state is scattered and in silence. You got the Forest Service doing a lot of work on their land. You got CAL FIRE working with private landowners. You got state parks doing work on their land. And you've got all these different grant programs and all these scattered efforts. So our job as a task force, my job when I took over this position was, can we pull that all together into one comprehensive plan? So the public, key stakeholders, members of the legislature can understand what CAL FIRE is doing, what the Forest Service is doing, what we're doing in the WUI, what we're doing in the general forest, how we're dealing with reforestation, every topic under the sun. It's all there in one comprehensive plan. And you think that might have been done before, but again, this is an area where work is very decentralized. People are so used to having centralized solutions to things like, reducing emissions at the federal level or at the state level. In the forestry world, everything is local. So one of our biggest challenges is, how do you scale up this incredibly decentralized system that we have to get people working together? So that's one of our biggest challenges at the task force, is to stay local, to understand that everything needs to be tailored to regional and local priorities and needs, because every community has a different mix of thinning and prescribed fire and evacuation routes and home hardening, all these measures that your listeners are familiar with. There's a different mix that's appropriate in each area. So what we're trying to do with the task force is give local areas, not tell them, okay, Riverside County or Placer County, you need to be treating there or there, but to give them the latest state-of-the-art tools so that they can do that. So if you're in the Eastern Sierra, where they care so much about recreation, it's a key part of their economy, and water, they can use our so-called decision support tools to prioritize those areas. Whereas if you're in a different area and you really care more about timber supply and carbon storage, then you can use a different set of tools to try to figure out, where you should be treating. So what we're trying to do is ramp up our efforts to give all of these local collaboratives, who would often spend years submitting a grant proposal, try to figure out, well, what's the health of my forest? How do we have sensitive species? Are our forests too dense, et cetera? We're streamlining that. We're giving them what we're calling a regional resource kit that says, here's 100 data sets for your area, everything from water to carbon to biodiversity to fire risk, so that they can plug those data sets into a decision-making tool that will allow them to better plan and prioritize projects. So it's all about scaling up, trying to transition from projects that used to be tens of acres or hundreds of acres to thousands of acres.
What a complicated task.
Yeah, it's a big effort, but the good news is, particularly in our bipolarized world that we're all living in, there's broad-based support for everything we're doing. There are no major state federal splits, rural urban splits, Democrat Republican splits, in part because we're going local. The communities are deciding where to treat. So that helps a lot in terms of trying to build overall support for what we're trying to do.
And you said that to help the local communities with their decision process, you gave them 100 pieces of data approximately. And do those come from the same agencies that you're working with?
Yeah, so we have a science advisory panel that reviews all of that data, make sure it's peer reviewed, make sure it's accurate, and then we compile it into what we're calling a forest data hub that's freely available to all the folks who want to access it throughout the states. It's open source, free data for all these different collaboratives. We've also taken us 3 years to do this, but we've also developed what we're calling an interagency tracking system. You think it'd be easy just to map all the projects that have taken place in the last 3 years. Well, the problem is the federal agencies, the state agencies, the local agencies all count acres treated differently. Okay, and some use fiscal year, some use calendar year, some, use different categories of projects. And the biggest issue we've had is double counting. So if the state agency gives the county funding to do work on federal land, all three of them count it. So we've spent, again, years with our engineers and our technicians getting what we call spatial data, where these projects are, so that we can confirm how much work is being done and how much work is being planned. So for the first time ever, if you're looking out into the next 5 years, if you're the Forest Service and you're planning a project in this area, there might be a state Caltrans project along the highway nearby. You've never had the ability to know that before. So again, it's just a massive effort of trying to mobilize resources to integrate and coordinate the work of a dozen different agencies that would otherwise be working in silos.
Wow. Sounds like you're, trying to unravel the Warren Commission report there. Right.
Well, the good news again is there's so much buy-in. We had a meeting a month ago in South Lake Tahoe. We drew nearly 500 people to a meeting for which there's no decisions being made. It's just that people are hungry for these tools. They're hungry for information. They see us really trying to help them get where they need to be.
Is that at the WUI conference?
No, we have task force meetings twice a year that we alternate between Northern California and Southern California, where folks come from around the state to hear updates on how we're doing across the board.
Okay. And is your focus mostly on, pre-mitigation, or do you get involved in suppression activity?
Well, it's almost entirely on what I would call forest health, which is, we're transitioning from single agency, single purpose projects, timber project here, fuel reduction project there, to multi-benefit projects. And then after, of course, fires, we're focused on reforestation, which is, another great example of, you've got the private sector has its own nurseries and seed banks and cone collectors, and so does state parks, and so does the Forest Service. We've pulled together a joint effort where they're all sharing those resources. So again, a lot of the work is not glamorous. It's just getting agencies that are used to doing their own thing to share their resources and work better together.
So you're really function more like a Henry Kissinger diplomat, trying to go back and forth and get people talking to each other so that they can work together.
Right. It's a lot of facilitation. But again, it's facilitation among agencies who see the benefits. It's not so much conflict resolution as it is just trying to get better alignment.
Right. I guess the conflict would simply come from people's resistance to change.
It's resistance to change, and it's agencies, cultures, and rules. So the people are wonderful, but often particular agencies have certain ways of financing projects, replanting trees, and it's particularly hard at the mid-level, because the mid-level folks are really, for lots of good reason, these rules were developed over time. but there's a clash with how another agency might do the exact same work.
I
It's
see.
not that one's better or worse, it's just that they're different.
Right. And they're bought into the reason that they do it the way they do it.
Yeah.
So,
So,
okay. So how did you come into this job? Like,
well, I spent the early part of my career doing something similar in California water. I was the head of an interagency uh, uh, task force called the CalFed Bay Delta program. When that program ended, I migrated to Lake Tahoe. And soon after I started, this is almost 20 years ago, the Angora fire hit. And it was the first major fire that had ever hit the Tahoe Basin. Unfortunately, it destroyed 254 homes. And it was a
wow.
real wake-up call in the basin that the Tahoe Basin is very, very vulnerable to fires. There's only one 2-lane highway that goes all around the lake, and it draws
Right.
millions and millions of visitors every year. And so we started a process there to try to align the work of 5 counties, 2 states, several different fire districts. And we're very effective in doing that. And so when the task force opening arose a couple of years ago, I stepped up and are trying to use the same methods we used in Tahoe to get California and Nevada aligned, to get California aligned.
I see. Okay. And at what range, of the fire's life do you step in? When you go to a Tahoe, do you work on things like evacuation route hardening because of this
Well, we try to work
two-lane access?
on pretty much everything that is prevention or resilience related. So yeah, in the community areas, we don't do this work directly, but we're trying to help align agency programs in the WUI that deal with things like home hardening, defensible space, evacuation routes. And in the general forest, it's more aligning the work of the land management agencies.
I
So
see. Okay.
both sides of that coin.
And are people as passionate about the forested areas as they are about the communities they live in, or is there a different
Oh,
level of?
absolutely. The
Yeah.
forested areas, particularly in rural California, it's their economic engine. Whether it's timber supply or what's recreation, folks are passionate about the forest and the benefits they bring to communities. So I think the bigger issue until recently is to get urban California to pay attention to the forest. In the same way
Yes.
that it's hard to get them uh, concerned with watershed management because you turn on the
Right.
tap and the water's always there. Forests are always there, out of sight, out of mind. But what's really changed things, I'm sure you and your listeners can appreciate, is smoke. For the
Yes.
first time in the last couple of years, the Bay Area, Southern California have been inundated with smoke from these wildfires. That's been a big wake-up call. It's made a really big difference in mobilizing urban support for more money. Because keep in mind, like it or not, the rural areas are more conservative. Coastal areas are more liberal. Getting the coastal areas on board with more money flowing to rural areas is absolutely vital. And so
Absolutely.
smoke, ironically, has been a big key to doing that.
That day that we woke up and we saw those pictures of the Brooklyn Bridge completely smoked out and the Manhattan skyline red,
Exactly.
I thought that was a great day because
Yeah.
it accomplished exactly the purpose that, it
Yeah.
showed the city dwellers, this isn't just a rural issue. It's not just
Yeah.
a Western issue. It's an everywhere issue.
Right. Exactly.
International. I mean, they were breathing Canadian smoke,
Right.
which, has a different accent, but the same impact. So what are the challenges that you're facing now besides
Well, I mean, good question.
and future
Get asked
posed?
that question a lot. What's the big barrier? Well, there's really
Yeah.
3. One is
Okay.
that we need sustained funding at a high level. Very challenging to do given our state and federal budget situation. So we're trying to do what we can to try to scale up our funding. On the federal side, a lot of benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act, so-called Bill and IRA funding, gave the Forest Service billions of dollars. That money hasn't run out yet. It still has a couple of years to go, but clearly there's going to be less federal funding in the future. The state also went through a situation a couple of years ago where they had big surpluses. Now we're in a deficit situation. So trying to keep sustained funding alive, is a big challenge. But fortunately, the governor is very supportive of that, largely protected wildfire funding from the cuts that have taken place. So that's number one is funding. Number two is workforce. Like almost every other labor sector in the country, we just lack the labor supply to get this work done. It's particularly acute in the forest sector because we used to have a thriving timber market, 20, 30, 40 years ago before the timber wars. Most of those mills have disappeared. We just don't have the workforce we need. So we're trying to gear up to get that going. And then finally, we need more places to put the wood. Again, we used to have thriving wood processing facilities in California. Very few of those are left. So we're trying to jumpstart with grants and loans and other innovative programs to try to get them back. So it's basically a level of effort, funding, work, load is the only thing that's holding us back.
Which is a lot, right?
Well, and I would say too that there depends on where you are in the state, but we need to build better acceptance of using fire. It's a tough sell when the state's burning to say we need more fire. But folks are coming along. They came along in Tahoe, coming along in other areas. When you explain to people, would you like your fire in small doses or would you like it, in a big catastrophic fire? It's not a tough sell once you explain it, but it's not obvious to people before you explain it. So we've got a lot of work to do to get people used to introducing more fire into the system.
I see. And I've been hearing the term prescribed smoke as well as prescribed burn now.
That's right.
Is that one of the strategies for selling that?
Yes. Yeah.
And
trying to grow our prescribed fire workforce is a really high priority. Again, it's challenging to do that because most of the folks that are trained to do that are off fighting fires. So to try to dedicate enough staff to actually get out there and do prescribed fires is another challenge, but we're making great steps to try to do that. And also to develop what we call in California and other areas, prescribed burn associations. So to get torches in the hands of ranchers and local communities, one of the best ways to build acceptance is to have communities themselves, backed by CAL FIRE and the agencies to make sure they don't get out of hand, but to have local communities get better trained in how to bring fire back into their communities at a level that they're comfortable with.
And when you are successful in getting landowners to engage in more prescribed burns, does that acreage then count in your million goal?
Absolutely.
So that's a really great way to leverage that because
so there's the phrase in the system is good fire. You've got
good fire. Yeah.
You've got managed fire at a low intensity level or prescribed fire, low intensity area. You've got managed fire. Agencies are still playing with the right name here. So when lightning hits, if you've built a fuel break already around that area, you can manage that fire at low intensity. And then you've got cultural fire that the tribes in California have been conducting for centuries. We're also trying to grow their ability to bring more fire back on their traditional lands. So all three of those practices count towards our acreage targets. And we're also increasingly starting to look at documenting the benefits of uncontrolled fire. Because often you'll have a large scale fire that might burn 10,000 acres, 20,000 acres, and half of it or more actually is good fire for the landscape. The attention of the media is always on, the worst part of the fire and, buildings that may be destroyed. But we're trying to tell the story that, there are two sides to virtually all fires.
What about the economic impact on real estate, people not being able to get insurance, and the insurance companies pulling out of the market because it's they're losing money in it?
Yeah, it's a tough issue in California and elsewhere. Insurance companies are really struggling as to how to properly assess the risk. And so, again, a lot of these data tools that we're developing, I think will help accelerate that process, make them more comfortable with writing insurance. Often you might be in a community and you'd have, 10 people in a cul-de-sac and, 8 of them, do their defensible space and their home hardening and the other 2 might not. Also, some of them might be with one insurance company and others might be with another. So it's very
Right.
complicated for insurance companies to sort of figure out what's the right policy to write for in any particular area. But I think you're going to see over time as these risk models and data emerge that are able to assess the effectiveness of the work on every parcel. I think you're going to see a lot more work and a lot more relief in that area.
Yeah, I think that's going to be very interesting. When you go to apply for insurance, they ask you all about your house
Yes,
and what's it made of, what's the roof made out of, how far
that's
from
right.
the fire hydrant, etc. But they never ask you about your neighbor's house.
Right. Right.
Is your late, are they in a 10-story completely wooden structure with a hay roof?
That's right.
And
That's right.
so those things
But
are all
again,
going
I think the
to,
insurance, back to your earlier question about, what's motivating this, I would say smoke and insurance. If your property, I mean, that's where folks who are not directly affected by fires feel the effect of fires, for sure.
right. And another question about the insurance folks, it seems that on a big active fire, there's a misalignment of the economic incentives, right? And the goals, because people make money on fires, right? They accept the insurance companies,
Well,
so, right?
yeah,
I mean,
I'm
you
not
sell
sure.
more retardant, you sell more drops, you sell more dozer line, like money changes hands the longer a fire goes, which is not to say that anyone would let a fire go, uh, for that incentive. But the insurance companies are always the ones, taking it in the shorts in the end. And I'm wondering why, given the fact that they're the ones who ultimately pay the cost of these fires, that they either choose not to or don't have the opportunity to have a bigger hand in how the suppression is done.
Right, right,
They're really at the mercy of the state, or
right,
whatever the responding agencies are, to hope that they get these assets protected.
right,
But
right.
if you fail to protect them, the state's not on the hook for that. The insurance
Yeah,
company is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Clearly, we've got a lot of work to be done. California, among other states, is really trying to get a better handle on linking the work of insurance companies, the risk models they use. California's recently announced that they're going to be working with an academic consortium to develop our own models. So
Okay.
I think all those things together with better data will help a lot.
I see. Okay. And so are they active in the conversation too? I
Oh,
imagine the
sure,
smoke that
sure.
you spoke about,
Yeah.
has huge financial consequences in medical health.
Sure. I mean, they obviously have a big interest in advances in things like the effectiveness of different techniques, whether it's home hardening, a defensible space, or other things. So insurance companies, they also have their own research arms. They're looking at all these different things so that they can play. But they're definitely essential players in the debate here.
And how do you navigate um, that government private conversation, or how do you facilitate that?
Well, I mean, our focus is on protecting communities and protecting landscapes. And so, as long as we're laser focused there, whether it's private sector people or public sector people, our tools are freely available. They're, free, transparent, open source. What we want to do is give public agencies, private landowners, insurance companies, utilities, everybody that's out there, basically get them using not necessarily the same tools, because folks can use different tools, but similar data sets that's validated. So everybody's working off the same data so that we can jointly assess what's working, what's not working, what areas are more and less, protected than others.
Okay. And you said two of your big obstacles were getting enough money and getting enough people.
Right.
Um, so, do you know how wildfire ranks in the taxpayers' priorities? And do you have reasonable comfort that with a change of governor, the taxpayers would still back you to the degree they are?
Oh yeah, no, there's no question that
Okay, cool.
it's a high priority. We were fortunate enough in November, the voters of California passed a bond as a $10 billion climate bond. $1.5 billion of those dollars are going to our work. to fire prevention work. So it passed. I don't know what the number was, but it passed comfortably. And so I don't expect that to change. I think there's very strong support in California for the kind of work we do, particularly because of the multi-benefit aspect of it. It's not only saving communities, but as we talked about before, it's helping with recreation, it's helping with wildlife, it's helping with biodiversity, water quality. There's so many public benefits. I think
Yeah.
the old world was forest projects pay for themselves through timber receipts. That was sort of the old model. And so, candidly, there wasn't a lot of public funding coming from either the Forest Service nationally or from California for prevention work, because the theory was that was taken care of. That world has changed with these megafires. People are understanding that there are broad public benefits of doing these treatments. They're not just thinning projects or projects that help serve the timber industry.
Okay. And are there ways to modify the way the timber industry harvests so that
And they
it's
are. I mean, I think
yeah,
the big sea change what is now that most of the action is thinning smaller diameter trees, because that's our real problem. You have lots of the underbrush, small diameter trees, fire hits them, and then the fire raises up into the canopy and becomes a canopy fire that takes
right.
off. And so there's a common understanding that the ticket is to try to get rid of these small diameter trees. The challenge is there aren't good markets for those things.
Right.
And
Toilet paper
so
and paper towels, right?
a lot of innovation going into things like biochar, where you turn it into basically charcoal as a soil amendment. We want to ramp up using it in wood products. We want to use it in biofuels. The Air Resources Board is developing a pipeline process so that forest fuel can be turned into biogas that's used to provide transportation fuel. But a lot of that is just beginning to take off. It'll be another 5 or 10 years before we can really get, I think, mature markets going for some of this smaller diameter material. That's our top priority.
Yeah, I remember when people would say, stop using paper towels all over the place. Just get a rag, right? You're killing trees.
Yes,
But
exactly.
what you're actually doing is you're creating an economic market for this wood product that otherwise, accumulates, and
That's right.
there's not incentive. So, are you saying we should use more paper towels?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a sustainable source. I think we have to get
Yeah.
people thinking more about how wood can be a sustainable source to help California's economy across the board.
No, absolutely. And what about the labor side? How do
The
you go
labor side
about
is so
building that?
challenging.
Yeah.
We're trying to fund, community college programs, everything that we can do to try to get the workforce up, to make it a more, rewarding career and one that has salaries that are competitive. It's just a
Right.
tough battle, as it is in many other markets in the state. It seems to have affected, just about all sectors of the economy, but it's particularly acute here because of the level of expertise you need to be able to be a forester, or to operate, equipment, things like that. So it takes a fair amount of training.
Yeah. And you spoke about the importance of prescribed or good fire, right, as a very effective tool in improving biodiversity and doing a lot more than mechanical thinning for a lot less money, as long as you
No,
protect that
exactly.
it.
And so we have a number of centers to certify people as burners, as they call them, and to try to ramp up our prescribed fire workforce. I'd say that's probably among the many workforce issues, that's probably the highest priority, is just to increase the pool of folks that can do prescribed fire, particularly because our fire season is now year long. So it's very,
Yes.
very difficult for agencies to defend pulling people off of fire, or grabbing people from the East Coast or from other countries to fight fire, and not the person who's doing a prescribed fire next door. So it's a real challenge from a workforce perspective. We've got to have a workforce that's large enough to handle the fires that are taking place together with prescribed fire. The seasons aren't entirely the same. I mean, most of our bigger fires are in the summer, most of the prescribed fires in the fall, but increasingly we're getting bigger fires in the fall as well. So it's a challenge trying to develop a workforce that can handle both sides of the equation.
As the falls turn into summers and the summers turn into super summers.
That's right. Exactly.
Right. That's all escalating dryness, windiness, and heat. Yeah. So when the smoke runs through San Francisco and LA, that's essentially good for you because it's getting the urbanites on board with the need to protect the wilderness areas. So I would imagine a bad day for you would be, when a prescribed burn like the New Mexico fire gets loose and destroys people's
Absolutely.
homes. And then now, you're fighting this uphill battle against people's fear of these prescribed burns. How do you address that?
And that's the fear as we ramp up inevitably, even if it's just, one fire out of 100,
Right.
that gets all the media attention, that gets the focus, makes people concerned. So it's a balance. And it also, it requires people to have faith in the folks that are doing the work. And I think it's fair to say some communities in California have a history, and it's taken many of them, particularly in the Northern California area along the coast, where tribes have been doing prescribed fire for a while, Mendocino area. There's a culture of doing fires that's been there for decades. So getting that community comfortable is easy. But if you're, say, closer to Redding at the head of the Central Valley, where recent fires have had, devastating impacts on those communities, trying to turn them around overnight, it's not going to happen. It's going to take years of people getting used to it, seeing their neighbors, seeing neighborhoods, driving by, seeing a sign that says, prescribed fire, don't call the fire department. It takes years of people understanding that fire is a part of California's landscape.
Yeah, then you're bringing it back.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing work and incredibly complex because the number of players you have in the mix that you can't just write a prescription. Here's how the state's going to do fire, and then everyone's going to go along with that because. And I guess it sounds like
rule, because the culture in every community is different. The need is different. The measures that are going to be effective is different. The best we can do, again, is to try to give these local communities the tools they need to scale up. That can be frustrating. You've got a crisis and folks say, well, why don't you just map the highest priority areas and get them done? It's not that simple. Again, you've got to build the culture. You've got to have the workforce. You've got to have broad-based support. You don't want litigation. So it takes a lot of capacity building, a lot of training, and a lot of work to, plan and prioritize projects over time, which can be a challenge.
Yeah, and it's probably also a challenge to identify any community that says that they're not the top priority.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think, in California, there are a few communities that aren't priority. Unfortunately, we've got many, many vulnerable priorities. And so what we're trying to do is those communities that are ready, that have their act together, they have a plan, we give them money to just go get your projects done. Other areas that aren't quite there yet, we're giving them what we call capacity building money to develop the workforce, to develop a strategic plan. And then once they're ready, then they can get money for their on the ground projects.
I see.
And that's a big change. It used to be, the pressure was with ribbon cuttings, et cetera, just fund shovel-ready projects and get them done. I think what we're realizing, we got to play the long game here. We got to build capacity statewide. We can't just reward areas that already have their act together and leave others behind. So we're really trying to take an across-the-board approach to try to mobilize communities throughout the state.
You must have an amazing team that works for you.
Well, we actually have a very small team, and one of our secrets of that is working through our member agencies. Our job is to bring CAL FIRE, our agencies, California, it's called CAL FIRE, Forest Service, the different parks agencies. We bring them together. We play a broker's role, facilitation role. Very careful to say, we're not the ones that are out there on the line doing the work. We're just the glue that helps
Hmm.
make the ship sail.
So to speak, right? The tar, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And is there anything in process where the strategies that you're employing in California can be studied and adopted by other states?
Oh, sure. I'm in, workshops and conferences all the time with our colleagues in the West. Many of them are developing similar tracking systems, similar tools. We're really trying to, in particular, see if we can reach agreement on what we call in the policy world outcome measures. Even though it's taken us, 3 years to simply count how many acres were treated, immediately folks are saying, well, that's interesting, but I don't want to know acres treated. I want to know how much you've reduced fire risk. I want to know how much carbon we're losing. I want to know what the water benefits are. So we're trying to work jointly with our federal colleagues and our colleagues throughout the West to see if we can reach agreement on common measures of progress. Because we don't want every area of the state or every area of the West measuring their reduced fire risk differently. And it's
Right.
very, very difficult then to tell Congress or the legislature what you're accomplishing if everybody's measuring, success or progress differently. Again, that's not easy. You can imagine every economist, every scientist has a different opinion on how you measure things like reduced fire risk or, carbon storage, but we're really trying to knock heads and try to see if we can at least align them and better understand how each other are doing that. And so the models talk to each other, even if they're not completely, in alignment.
I see. And tell me about the East Coast that largely saw themselves as immune to the fire risk,
Right.
maybe the smoke, but
Sure.
now New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania,
Sure.
and
Yeah, we're seeing a
South.
similar pattern, as what happens with so many things that start in California, spread to the rest of the country. I think, you know, obviously nobody wants to hope for more fires anywhere, more uncontrolled
Right.
fires, but certainly, the more that it's perceived as a nationally important issue, the more that'll be helpful in making sure the Forest Service, National Park Service, BLM, et cetera, get the funding they need to tackle the problem.
I see. Well, it's you really inherited this problem from 100 years of oversuppression,
That's right.
and now you're being asked to come in and in a few years,
Right.
put things back
Well,
right.
and that's another lesson that, is difficult to hear sometimes in the political world is, it took us a century of fire suppression got us here. We're not going to have resilient forest in the next 2 or 3 years. It's
No,
going to take a decade at least to see, and that's difficult. Again, we're trying to come up with these measures of success. It's very difficult, even at the scale of treating 1 million acres, to show we're making a difference. But you change that from 1 million acres one year to 1 million acres 5 years in a row, all of a sudden you can start to say, hey, we're making a dent on the problem. We need to keep that money, rolling, sustained. We need to keep the workforce going, et cetera. So we're still, I think, a couple of years. We've got a big down payment in California, and with the federal bill, I think you're going to see over the next couple of years the results. We're already seeing results now. In fact, Cal Fire has this great tool that it's just developed where they actually have firefighters on the ground measuring what happens when the fire hits an area that has been treated versus an area that hasn't been treated, so that they can document in real time the benefits of these projects. And as you can imagine, that's very, very effective with, funders, whether it's Congress or the legislature. A lot of skepticism that these fuel breaks work because people are concerned, well, these fires are so big, the embers are just going to, cross all the fuel breaks. Well, sure, in a big mega fire, fuel breaks are going to just slow fires down. They're not going to necessarily stop them, but they provide important anchors for firefighters. In
uh-huh.
particular, we saw this in Lake Tahoe, which had one of the most devastating fires in recent memory. First fire that ever crossed the Sierra, threatening the whole town of South Lake Tahoe, 25,000 people, huge economic engine. Fire hit the surrounding neighborhoods that had been treated, and it dropped just like the models would tell you it would to
Wow.
low intensity fire. Those treatments also provided stations for the firefighters to build, their beachheads, so to speak. So it was a real, stunning and for me, having spent 20 years in Tahoe doing those projects, it was just so
Yeah.
gratifying to see. Yeah, these projects work, but they only work if they're done at a scale, that's large enough to make a difference.
Well, so the scaling is really the secret.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, you've certainly got your work cut out for you, Patrick.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Enjoy talking to you more. And certainly, if your listeners have questions, the task force, you can feel free to go to our task force website. Has everything imaginable on it as to what we're doing, particularly our tracking system and other tools if people want to play with them.
Yeah, and the governor's office seems to be backing your work and Cal Fire's work and the entire emergency response provided by the state really well, very
Oh,
actively.
absolutely. I mean, Cal Fire has the strongest firefighting team in the world. There's no question about that. They've got all the latest equipment, tankers. We've got cameras throughout the state now that monitor these fires. So as soon as there's even a whiff of smoke, you can sit at your laptop and you can see where that fire is, and the wind, the temperature, the climate, the soil moisture. It's really incredible, the tools that California is bringing to the suppression side. It's not an area I work in, but the advances are just amazing in terms of increasing our ability with new technology to tackle this problem.
And I think so many people are motivated to want to help in the wildfire space.
Right.
Not just in suppression, but in the development of all this technology and the tools that you're going to have to use. What is the website that people can check out?
It's task force www. Gosh, I am drawing a blank on my own.
You can look. It's an open book.
Wildfiretaskforce.org.
That's pretty good.
That's it. Pretty easy.
Awesome.
Everything you want to see on there.
.org. All right. So if you want to learn more about the work that Patrick and his agency are doing, Wildfire Task Force. I can't even say it.
Wildfiretaskforce.org.
Wildfiretaskforce.org. Check that out. There's a lot of great work coming out of that agency, and really thank you for sharing with me the complexity of the task that you're doing. It sounds honestly like no fun.
Well, I appreciate your spreading the word. The more people hear about the importance of our work and yours, the better. So thank you for the kind invitation to have me on your show.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. Well, folks, we're just wrapping up with Patrick Wright. I'm going to have to get some new teeth, I think, today. From the Governor's Wildfire Task Force. You have been listening or hopefully watching. Well, maybe not watching. Like, we're not the best looking guys. We do what we can. Anyway, for tuning in, let's say, to the Fire Break. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire at teamwildfire.com. Check us out right after you check out Patrick Wright's website at California. We'll see you at the next one, and thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Steve.